I guess my earliest memory goes back to the mid to late 30s. Vividly, I remember going to attending Greek school at St. Barbara's. I was probably about 4 years old at the time. And of course, my sisters would drag me there. Mary was in charge, of course, being older than Mal by a couple of years. But I remember the East Side was a great place to be raised. It was all family. We happened to have a preponderance of Greek people from Limnos, and more specifically from Atsiki, my mother's village. And many were older than my mother, and they filled the role of my grandmother, in a sense. And they made sure that everything was going well within the family. But we were very fortunate also. We didn't have much, but we weren't poor. Papu always had the restaurant, and if he didn't sell the food, we ate it. Or if there was any food left over, cakes, bread, we would take them home. But I remember the 30s vividly. It was a very close-knit, close bonded area. We, of course, interfaced mostly with the Greeks, but we were very, very friendly with the Italian people and the Jewish people. We were also fortunate that the Jewish people that lived in our immediate area, in our tenement, were Sephardic Jews that apparently could, trace their origins back to the days of the Inquisition. And they came to Greece and lived in Greece, and they were, as far as I was concerned, they were no different than, my relatives or neighbors that we had, except that they were Jewish. And I do remember in my very early years, as soon as I was capable of putting switches on and setting thermostats, I was the shamus goy for the synagogue across the street from us on Broome Street. But we had a great relationship with our neighbors, both Greek, Jewish, Italian, and so forth. I remember public school, PS 42. That was a hodgepodge of immigrant children, but very good education. In fact, I can tell you most of our teachers all were female, and I would say about 80 to 85% of them were spinsters. That they were that dedicated, to their profession. What else can I tell you?
Well, that was also one of the only job opens to women, too.
Yes.
I mean, that was a traditional
Precisely.
thing. And,
Precisely. And just as a sidebar, I'm sure that the Jewish people took advantage of it. They had good educations, and they all became teachers, or for the most part became teachers. But I remember the Greek school teacher that we had. His name was Kyriaki, and my father was extremely fond of this gentleman. He was well educated, and when my father had occasion, he'd have many, many conversations with the Greek school teacher. But one day we found out that he was let go from his job by the St. Barbara's Parish Council. And my father was a member of the Parish Council, but apparently he did not make that meeting, and it was news to him, and he was crushed, really. This man was a good man and a good friend of my father's. And I remember my father going to church the following Sunday after he had gotten the news, and he said that I think you should hire this man back. And they were adamant about, just keeping with their decision. And my father got up and said, well, if you don't hire him back, my children will never step school in the St. Barbara's Greek school any longer. And he held to his word. That following the Sunday after that, we went to the cathedral, 74th Street, and immediately started to go to Greek school there, which was, quite an ordeal. We got out of public school at 3 o'clock, got home and gobbled up a glass of milk and a piece of cake, and got on to the Third Avenue L and went to Greek school from the hours of 4 to 6. And by the time we got home, it was 6:30, 6:45. So that was quite a hunk out of our life. But for me, it was great. I think for my sisters, it was great. I know that Mal met Arthur through the cathedral. I befriended Eddie at a young age. In fact, we go back to probably, as best that I could remember, a month before or a month after World War II started. And that's how far back I go with Eddie. And of course, I met my wife through Eddie, my friend, and a lot of friendships. And
Well, it
unfortunately,
also took you. It took you really into the larger world. It was
oh,
a step into the larger world.
no
That
question,
was out of the
no
the
question,
neighborhood, the ghetto, if you will.
no
Which,
question. I mean, when we went to the cathedral, the first Sunday that we attended services there, we were shocked to hear a choir. Heretofore, well, at St. Barbara's, there was always a chanter, a psalty, but this time we heard a choir and a professional choir at that. The music was just outstanding. Everything was great about the cathedral. I mean, we immediately got engulfed and entwined in the youth activities that the cathedral had to offer. It wasn't only Greek school, but we had a superb youth director by the name of Dr. Nick Eliopoulos. And he was not only the youth director, he was the choir director, he was the Greek school teacher, and he also had a camp that he ran, Camp Olympia in Branchville, New Jersey. And we were introduced to that. And as you said, our scope just broadened it. It multiplied geometrically. I mean, we went to Camp Olympia. Every Saturday morning, we would go to the YMCA, and there we'd exercise, and we'd play basketball, we swam, and immediately after that, we'd gobble up a sandwich that we either brought with us, or if we could afford to buy, we did. And then spent the next 2 or 3 hours in Central Park playing ball, or, just creating, friendships, lasting friendships. And it was just great. And in the summertime, Nick would provide a scholarship, a 2-week scholarship for Camp Olympia. And I think it was $20 a week or $25 a week. And I'm sure my father sprang for that money. And I started going to Camp Olympia in 1939. In fact, I was only 6 years old, and I had to go with the girls. But I skipped 19. No, I went in 1940. For some reason, I didn't go in 41, but from 42 through 48, I went to Camp Olympia, and I think in 1948, I missed Camp Olympia because my parents went to Greece for the summer. It was almost a near emergency. Their parents, their mothers, were well into their 90s, and their health was failing. So Papu and Yaya made it to Greece in 1948, and I remember working the entire summer at my father's little restaurant, King Sandwich Shop. My cousin Tom took the responsibility of running the day-to-day operations, but I worked like a dog. I'm pretty sure I put in about 60, 65 hours a week, but it was well worth it just for making it possible for my father to go back to Greece and for my parents to go back to Greece to see their parents. But
How old were they in '48 when they went back?
48, Papu was 56 years old, and 48, Yaya was 40 years old. Uh, Papu, Papu came to the United States, just to give you a little background of his history. His first voyage here, his first trip here, was in 1910. He was 18 years old, and this was after spending probably a good 6 to 7 years in Alexandria, Egypt, where his father sent him, probably to save his life. I'm sure they found it very difficult to afford to raise their family. I think Papu had 3 other brothers and 2 sisters, and it was pretty rough on his parents at that time. And from what I understand, my grandfather had a good friend that had a bacalico, had a large store, and Papu went to work there, and he learned the business of running a store, operating store. He also picked up the practice of being a butcher, which he was important to him because he did work as a butcher after his second voyage. But in 1910, Papu worked somewhere in Hoboken, I believe in the brickyards. And I don't know, I'm pretty sure it was short-lived, but he did tell me that he lived in an apartment with 11 other men. And 6 of them happened to work during the day, and 6 of them worked at night. So I'm sure the beds never got an hour of rest. They served their purpose. He worked 6 days a week. I don't know how much he made at the time, but Sunday was his only day off. And on Sunday, he had invested in a shoe shine box and shoe shine supplies, and he went out shining shoes and made himself about 25, 35 cents on a Sunday, which afforded him the opportunity to eat at a tavern out in downtown New York. He lived in the, what was it called, the Five Corners section of Manhattan at the time. He was sponsored by and encouraged by his older brother Mike to come to the United States, and that's what motivated him to come here. But he worked odd jobs for about 3 years or so, and I think in 1913 he bought himself a little stand in the Wall Street area. I don't know the address of it, but he sold about a minimum amount of items, 5 or 6 items. He sold 2 newspapers, Coca-Cola, oranges and apples, and maybe a candy bar. That's what he did. And he was living the American dream. He started making good money and sending money back to Greece. But unfortunately, World War II began in 1914, and he was encouraged by his brother and a few other lancemen to go back to Greece and, to do his duty as a Greek national, and defend his country. Most of the people that went back served a year and came back to the United States. I know my Uncle Mike came back in 1915, married in 1916, and started his family. Papu, unfortunately, got stuck in the Balkan Wars, and he didn't get out until 1920. So he spent 6 years, probably the best years of his life, mostly in trench warfare. And he developed an attitude as a result, as a result of that. I thought it was a good attitude. He lived like every day was a bonus. He he realized that he missed out in life. He had very few opportunities. We discussed that quite often. I remember telling him that had he been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, he probably would have had a great amount of opportunities and bettered himself. But he held no regrets. He said, you only can learn by history. You can't change history. And another good attitude that he developed was that he was going to live his life and through his children. He enjoyed our accomplishments. I remember Mary, when she graduated high school, was a tremendous milestone for him. When Mal graduated college, he was, excuse me, he felt that he had excuse me again, he had accomplished those feats himself. He lived a good part of his life through his children's experiences. In 1920, when he came back, he immediately went to work as a butcher and made a living. In fact, he made a fairly decent living. I have probably somewhere in this house a check for $1,000, which represented a loan that he made to his employer, the fellow that owned the butcher shop. He had it tough going, and I think it was during the Depression time when my father already had opened up a restaurant. He had lent him $1,000 to be able to sustain himself in his business. But in any event, I'll go back to my mom for a second.
Let's stick with Papu for a little bit.
Okay.
Let's stick with. I want to. I think he's very interesting character. Very when we got to see it, I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people who have had tremendous accomplishments. And a lot of them I've been very fortunate to meet them when they're old, when they're nice, they finally have time to sit down. And, he always had time for us.
Oh, yes.
And the simplicity of, what we knew him as, he was 60 something when I was born. He was no longer working. I mean, I remember years when he was doing the elevator thing, but I don't think of him much as an entrepreneur, like, a lot of these other people who come over, maybe the war experience is what changed that. But I always saw him as, for me, he was the model of a Greek person in terms of his humility, what I saw as genuine humility, and his belief in, his church, his religious beliefs, and just his basic beliefs in the goodness of other people. Many other Greeks have disappointed me after, not living up to that. But talk so about, in some ways running a store is, I know it's a very Greek immigrant thing to do, but I don't think of him as an entrepreneurial type.
No.
So to talk a little bit more about his character.
Okay. Firstly, when he purchased a restaurant initially, he was partners with my Uncle Angelo, my mother's older brother. And they ran the business together until, I believe, 1938 or so. I thought Angelo at the time was in his 40s, and I'm sorry, it was prior to that. I think Angelo left to get married. He left for Greece to get married in 1932. I had never seen him since I was born in 1933. But to show you the type of person and the type of individual my father was, he meticulously and religiously sent half of the proceeds on a monthly basis to Uncle Angelo until 1938, when he could no longer do it financially. They were just getting out of the Depression, and he had just used a good deal of his resources. But that was the type of individual he was. The other thing I can tell you, besides that $1,000 check, which will give you an insight as to what your grandfather was, I had a book that Papu kept. And what he would do is people ran a tab with him. They would purchase their meals or whatever and pay at the end of the week. Well, the book probably shows about 20 individuals who never paid or never got even Steven with him. But that's how he was. He took care of his customers. He really did. We had people who would come to the store at 5:30 after work and immediately start drinking beer, and they'd put a half a load on by 7 o'clock. And Papu was so worried about them that he would prepare or have me prepare a plate of food so that they can have food in their mouth. He was concerned about them getting into an accident or getting home, and that was the type of individual he was. He was a very giving person. He was self-taught. He never went to Greek school, never went to school at all, but he knew how to read and write. He mastered the art of simple mathematics very easily. And another thing about him, he had an inner drive to improve himself. I remember not only did he start teaching himself how to read, but in the latter part of his life, when he went to work as an elevator operator, he found a treasure of books written in Greek at the Brooklyn Library, and he would rather read than sleep at night, which he did quite often. But he read all of the books, many of which I had written and I had read in school, and we were able to discuss them. But in the latter in the latter 10, 15 years of his life, as soon as he started having grandchildren, I remember he would take you to the park or take you to the Statue of Liberty, take you to various places, the Empire State Building, and he had a ball because not only was it an opportunity to be with his grandchildren, but he was learning quite a bit from you people, from your generation as well. But he enjoyed his latter years. He enjoyed life, even though he was deprived of opportunities to acquire wealth, opportunities to achieve his potential, and he had a tremendous amount of potential. He was still a very happy person. He was indeed a happy person, and
well, let me tell you a story. I'll talk it loud enough so people can hear it. It's going to cut about Hapu that was really pretty funny, I think. You remember how he dressed all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was always heavy clothes. I mean, we can talk about the hernia band and all that, but the underwear, the winter underwear came out in
from July
September.
14th to August 15th. Yeah,
that's when it was off. Everything else. So anyway, but I was I was intrigued, very much a part of the counterculture and all that stuff, and there was on 6th Street and 2nd Avenue was in one of the old Yiddish theaters, and it was called the Fillmore East, and it was where all the Jimi Hendrix, all the rock and roll bands were playing, all the hippie bands were there, and there was a big show coming up, and this was before Ticketron. This was before, if you wanted to buy tickets, you had to go to the box office. So so there was a show coming up, with the act was called Delaney and Bonnie.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't get in the city to get the things. I was in high school, so I asked him to buy me tickets. So here's my, and first of all, the confusion in the beginning was I said Delaney and Bonnie, and he says it's on Delancey Street. Delaney was spelled without, like Delancey without the C. Anyway, I just have these real images of him, this old man in that owl cap, you know,
Yeah.
that beanie, that woolen cap, and the long overcoat, standing in line with all these hippie freaks. He's 30, 40 years older than anybody else there. And just, you know, what are they saying? He's got his cash and he buys the tickets, and I went to the concert. So it's, you know, that I've always really enjoyed the image of him, you know, standing on line there, and what everybody else is thinking when he's buying tickets.
You know, that brings to mind another incident when you're talking about his attire. Living on the Lower East Side, I remember back in the early 50s, the trend was pegged pants, zoot suits. And I bought a pair of pegged pants, and it was a crazy color, and I didn't like it. It was like a cream-colored pants. And he saw them one day, and he says, you know, it's a shame that you're not wearing these pants. And he put them on, and he was wondering why people were staring at him. He wore that, but he also enjoyed wearing my pants and shirts that I brought back from the Army, because he said, you know, they're good and strong. They'll last a long time. But he enjoyed the khaki pants and whatnot. But interesting guy. We had a lot of good times. One place that he enjoyed going to, believe it or not, was the synagogue on Eldridge Street. He used to love to listen to the cantors, because they were the precursor, the preamble to chanting, and he loved Greek chanting. So he would drag me to the synagogue on Eldridge Street, and they had fantastic cantor. And we would go there, even like on Yom Kippur, to listen to their chants. He was interesting. He knew what was going on in this world. I remember December 7th, 1941. We were visiting a very, very good friend. It happened to be a day after or 2 days after the Feast of St. Nicholas. And this gentleman's name was Nicholas, and we were visiting him, and all of the old men who had served in World War I were huddled up listening to the radio, and it was a bad day in their lives. It brought back a lot of memories, and you know, they thought that they had participated in the war that would end all wars, only to have World War II to come to by. And another thing I can tell you about World War II, Tom, my cousin Tom, who worked with my father since, I guess, the mid-30s or so, early 30s, went off to the Army, and it was a lot of hard work for my father to run the store. And Papu, unfortunately, made a mistake in reading a letter that we had gotten from the government. It was from the Office of Price Administration. Everything, all prices were frozen, and Papu translated it incorrectly. The letter said that you are permitted one more increase, but after that, there's a price freeze until the duration of the war. And Papu translated it to mean that there's a price freeze immediately. So we didn't get that the opportunity. And we were selling sandwiches, a bologna sandwich, which consisted of 2 slices of white bread or whole wheat or whatever it was, whole wheat or a roll, 5 slices of bologna, a good amount of lettuce, mayonnaise or mustard, and wrap it up and put it in a bag for 10 cents or something like that. And he was actually making mills on each transaction. You know, there were, well, some things we were able to do pretty good on. I remember our tuna salad was the best in the Greenwich Village area, and ironically enough, it didn't contain any tuna fish whatsoever. We made it out of mackerel and bonita, and we used a lot of bread and mayonnaise and water, and because the bread expanded. And I remember right after World War II, an inspector coming around, because at that time I was a teenager and I was able to help him, and he asked for the ingredients of the tuna salad, and we showed him. We never lied. We showed him the bonita and the mackerel, and he said, from this point on, he said, you can't sell this as tuna salad. Sell it as fish salad or something like that. But he was a good businessman. He worked extremely hard, and he thought a lot of his customers too. He just didn't take advantage of them, and he worked many hours. I'll give you another incident of how what really made Papu tick. It was in I guess around, had to be 46 or 47. He suddenly took ill in the morning, and he had to, ambulance came and took him to the hospital. And it was that day that I was taking an exam to get into Stuyvesant High School. And I remember I didn't want to take the exam. I really felt that I should be at the store or with my father. And I had a tremendous argument with your mother, with my sister Mal. And she argued and argued and argued. And finally, I just got tired of her arguing, and I did take the exam. And thank heaven she insisted that I take the exam. But at another place where I met this guy, he was going to Stuyvesant as well, Eddie. But
well, you can tell the story. I've heard this story many times. It sounds like like my mother was just passing down what Papu had done to her when she wanted to take the test for Hunter.
mm-hmm.
You can tell that story. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think she took
She was going to
took the
Seward.
test. She was going. No, she wanted to go to Seward. She was taking the test while she was still in junior high school. And because our junior high school included the first year of high school. We went to high school for 3 years and not 4. But she passed the test and started to go to Hunter High School. And she had second thoughts. She really wanted to go back to, wanted to go to Seward with her friends. And my father said, look, you made your bed, you have to sleep in it now, for all intents and purposes. And thank heaven for that too, because she did very well at Seward. But Papu was that type. If you talked him into something, he bought into it, you better buy into it. You better live it through the end of the contract or whatever the school year was. But well, getting back to that time, that period of time, Papu had gotten ill, and I remember he was in the hospital for about 4 or 5 days, and when he got home, the doctor came to see him, and he said, the days of you working 12 and 15 hours a day are gone. He said, if you want to see your 2 children, finish school, you have to. Thea Mary had graduated already. He says you have to cut back your hours, which he did. And I was going to Stuyvesant, and when I started, I had the afternoon session, and I would finish up at 4 or 5 o'clock. and I would go to the store, and about 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and we would close up at 8 o'clock. I'd help him clean up, and he started to take to that particular those particular number of hours, but he started feeling better, and I noticed that he would be in the back in the kitchen, and he would be counting the proceeds for the day, and he was purposely killing time. I said, "Pop, why don't we go home? You know, everything is clean." He said, "Well, I have a mistake. I just have to find." He knew that the lunch hour for the second shift was approaching. And finally, a few people came. They saw a few lights on. They knocked on a window. The door was locked. They knocked on a window, and I told him we're closed. And he came running out. He said, "No, no, we're open. We're open." And he'd open the door, and the store was filled again. And we'd bring these people in, and all the cleaning that I had done had gone down by the wayside. And we'd have a discussion. I said, "You know, the doctor did tell you." He says, "But I'm feeling stronger." And he said, "But we made a little money, you know. At least we're paying for the electricity, we're paying for the lights and whatnot." I said, "Yeah, Pop, but we cleaned up the store. You know, what about my time?" He says, he says, "You don't count. Your time, you don't get paid for anything." He never did pay me, but what he did was he would throw some money under the counter, and he would tell me, "You know, it's time for you to sweep the store." And I would clean up, and I'd variably find 50 cents, 75 cents. So he did that a couple of times a week. So I was getting paid. And my other pay was my sister Mary when she went to work. She went to work for Standard and Poor's, which ironically was right across the street from our store. And I think she was making I don't know. I don't even think she was making $20 a week, but her pay was something like $18.42, which she would get in cash in an envelope. And I remember the Fridays she would open up the envelope and give me the 42 cents, which was a real nice thing. But
So
yeah,
where was the store? What would address was
the
it?
store was his first store was on Hudson Street between King and whatever. I forget the name. Hudson King and I forget the name of the street that was just north of King Street.
So it was just south of Houston Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the second store, King Sandwich Shop, was on King Street between Hudson, which was the extension of 8th Avenue, south of Hudson Street. 8th Avenue became Hudson Street, and Greenwich Street, which was the continuation of 9th Avenue. So that's where we were. It was,
And that's the building that when that building was redeveloped into a taller building, that's where he lost the lease, and that's why they
he
gave him
lost the
jobs
lease.
to-
In 1945, at the end of World War II, 46, his landlord, which happened to be Trinity Church, told him that they wanted him to get out because they had plans. They were building some skyscrapers or very tall buildings, and Papa kind of fought it. He got a lawyer, and he was paying good money, and he would get extensions. But finally, I believe in 48, 49, he ran out of extensions. They just wouldn't extend his time. And we spoke about it. In fact, that was another time where I really think I let the old man down. He found a, what did they call those? Brownstone. He found a brownstone on, it may have been on King Street or one block south of King Street, and up near 6th Avenue somewhere. And he thought he could open up a small sandwich shop And between the rents he got from the apartments and the sandwich shop, or the shop that he would open up, he'd be able to make a living. Because at this time he was, well, I guess he was in his 60s. I'm sorry, he was in his late 50s. He felt that he had some good years, and I very abruptly told him, "Pop, why don't you give it up? I'm going to go to college, and I just don't have the time." And I felt so sorry. It was like cutting the feet under him, But I did tell him, Trinity Church is a large employer, and you could get a job, as a maintenance man, as an elevator operator. I'm sure they'll give you a job. They're decent people. They were giving us all of these extensions, even though they're insisting on us getting out eventually. But he did finally get up the courage and ask for a job. And he got a job where he worked 40 hours a week. Unfortunately, he worked Saturday and Sunday nights. But the fact of the matter is that he was able to do a lot of things, one of which was enjoy his grandchildren. This was before having grandchildren, but this time off that he had enabled him to fill in a lot of things, do a lot of things, accomplish a lot of things that he probably had on his bucket list. One of which was watching the United Nations building go up. He was there about 3 times a week, checking progress. But it enabled him to visit libraries. It enabled him to, broaden his scope in a sense, do things that he wanted to do. He visited museums, and he did most of the stuff by himself. My mother really, couldn't tag along with him. She just wasn't physically capable of keeping up with him. But he did a lot of these things, which I'm sure he got a lot of satisfaction and gratification out of doing. But he visited parts of the city that he wanted to. He visited museums, which were, of most great interest to him. So it enabled him to do a lot of things. I thought it was it was hitting a home run going to work for his former landlord.
Well, it sounds also like, I don't know how long he lived with them, but there was also a pension there that he never would have gotten otherwise.
Yeah. Well,
It
it was a
something.
social security, and they were very good for him. While he was alive, they would send him, I think at Christmas time, $25 or $30, which he gratefully accepted. He thought it was the greatest thing in the world that they didn't have to do it, and he got his Social Security, which didn't amount to much, but he enjoyed his later life. He really did, and it enabled him to get to his church. He visited the church every day. He helped with maintaining the church. He did a lot of cleanup there, and he was very friendly with the priest. He visited other churches as well. It was a wonderful thing that he did, and of course, having the time when grandchildren came along, he visited them. And going up to the Catskills was a lovely thing for him. I remember the year that your family was living in Kingston, and he would go up and spend the 2 days that he had off during the week. I believe they were Wednesday and Thursday, I think it was Wednesday and Thursday, but he relived some of his earlier years. I remember him making fish traps where a fish can go in but couldn't swim out of it. And I remember him also experimenting in the woods there and getting poison ivy, poison sumac, poison oak, and having a bad case. Coming back home and going to work, I remember Yaya calling me at work, and she said, "You better come. Something's happened to Papu. He's all swollen." There were two incidents. The first incident was when his chest was just expanding, fatty tissue. And I remember bringing him to a doctor who was much older than him. He called my father Kid. So Radetzky was his name. He was on Broome Street near the Bowery. I took him to Radetzky. Radetzky felt the chest, and he said, it isn't any tumor. He said, allay all of these fears that you may have. He said, I have a hunch. I think I know what it may be. And I said, what is it? He said, when did he have his teeth extracted? So I said, back in the late 30s. So he says, just a hunch. He sent me to a clinic in the 20s on the east side. And he said, let them take an x-ray. I have a hunch that part of his tooth is still in his jaw somewhere, and it's infected, and it's causing this. And that's what it was. But I remember the dentist there said, can he withstand any pain? I said, he can withstand an enormous amount of pain. He said, well, I'm going to chisel that out of his jawbone. And that's what they did. And a couple of days later, he was fine. But that was one incident where Yaya called me at work. The second incident was when he had gotten this bad case of poison ivy, and she told me she tried everything to prevent him from going to work. And he was wearing long sleeves, so the appearance of the poison ivy, and it was summertime. But
I remember one of the poison ivy times. I think it might have been at least one. It was so scary to me because I'd never seen his
spewing
eyes were puffed closed. You couldn't see his eyes. He looked like a terrible. Yeah. But anyway.
But again, it was an old.
I remember the lesson of it is I think he was working in the garden and he saw these things and he had to clean them. He had to get these weeds out, and they were all poison ivy. So.
I know another funny incident. I remember him going. I'd recommend to him. This is before I was married. I was still living at home. I said, there's a great movie at the Loews at Delancey Street. And he said, yeah, you think I should go? I said, yeah, you'll love it, And I'd start telling him what it was about. And I get home from work the next day, and I said, you go to the movies? He said, yeah, but he said, they didn't show the movie that you were describing. But I did see the other one twice. What happened was that he'd fall asleep during the movie. And then when he went with Yaya to the movies, he had to go up front, and she had to sit and way in the back because of, problems they had with their eyes and whatever. So they'd get together. Going to the movies with Yaya was an experience. She would cry a lot. And even if it was a comedy, she would cry. She'd remember something, and then they'd argue why. He said, "You're embarrassing me by your crying," but a lot of fun. And he also, with Yaya, I remember this. This is I think Papu was working, and I had just come out of the army, gotten out of the army, and I'd make a date with a few friends, and we'd go out to the Chinatown for a meal. And I remember the one time, the very first time, there was so much Chinese food left over. So I asked the guys, "Are you taking this home?" And they said, "No." I said, "I think I'll bring it home to my folks." And I brought it home, and she said, "What's that?" I said, "Chinese food." She says, "Get it out of here." She wanted no part of it. But I went to my room, and I opened the door, and I can look out in the kitchen, and she kept looking at it, and finally the temptation was a little too much. She broke down, she opened it up, and she finished the whole thing. And then, of course, every time I went, she asked me, bring something back. She liked Chinese food. She also liked, and he also did, the Italian food. When they had their feast, San Gennaro and on Mott Street, I'd always bring them home pizza and whatever, the Zeppelis, those little balls with, and they loved it. But they would too. They'd go there at nights and visit. They kind of broadened their scopes. But,
That was a long time to be a soldier.
yes.
I mean, did he talk about his war experiences, and how do you think it? Aside from the fact that it took him out of business for a while and out of the stream of life, what do you think his war experiences were like?
He told me that it was horrible, especially trench warfare. He said there was a period of time for about 6 months they were in the same trench without, nothing changing. Maybe a little advancing, but getting back to the same trench. And he said it wasn't only the bullets that were flying from their enemy's rifles, but it was the filth, the dirt, the disease. It was just infested. So he never thought he'd get out of that. He really did. And that's what I said. It shaped an attitude that he had and a good one. Every day is a bonus day. And he lived his life that way till the very last day. Most interesting. You said something a little earlier when we had our break that before you went visiting with your family, your mother coached you that you don't ask for anything. Well, that came from Yaya Fianya. The three of us would sit down before we went anywhere, and she said, you don't ask, you don't take unless I give you the sign. And that's the way it was. And sometimes we were dying. Our mouth was salivating to have a meatball or a kuluraki, and we'd just watch. And the other thing that we were told to, when we went to church, we just sat down, and that was it. In fact, my mother, the old Greek churches on top of the altar had an eye. I guess it had to do with the evil eye and going back to, pre-Christianity. But she would tell me, whatever you do, wherever you go, that eye follows you. And as a little kid, I'd be doing something and I'd look at it and the eye was staring at me. Then I'd change my position or location and I would believe her. And the other thing she had me believing was biting my nails. She says, don't ever bite your nails. If you swallow a little nail, it'll go into your stomach and it's going to come out of your mouth. You're going to be the ugliest person in the world. So these are the things she had us believing. But she was a tough cookie. She swang first and asked later, and she believed in, Papu was from another school. I mean, I would take my mother's beatings any day than, Papu's preaching any day. That hurt. Papu's preachings hurt. And I remember several times he would catch your mother and I doing something, instead of walking the route that we were supposed to do, we'd walk another route because we had a penny or two to buy a caramel from a candy store. And he says, I told you not to do that, and you shouldn't have done it. But, that was punishment in itself. But Yaya, on the other hand, would take out her stick, her kutala, or whatever it was, and just beat you up.
Did she make you go and get it yourself?
What? The kutala? No,
see, that was the extra.
No.
See, that was the extra thing, is you had to go and get it.
No, I used to get under the bed, and I knew she had a stick, and I knew how where she would start, and I knew how long it'd take her. So I had it down to a science. So she thought she was poking me in the ribs or something like that, and I was, 2 feet away from it. But
All right, so talk about her. What do you know about her family, where she came out
well,
of?
she came to the United States 1913, at 1913 or 1914. She came to live with her oldest sister, Marianthi. Marianthi was the second oldest in the family, and she had already come to the United States. She was my father's age. She was born in 1892. Then when she came in 1913 or 1914, she was ready to start her family. I think she may have been pregnant with my cousin Tom. Also living with my Thea Marianthi and her husband, Uncle Jim, was my mother's brother, Angelo. And Angelo was, technically, he was my mother's, superior, call it what you may. And he lived with her.
Sponsor?
Well, sponsor, yeah. He was, whatever it was, what do you call it? I can't think, I'll think of it in a second.
What
But,
do you mean superior? I don't.
well, he was, she went to work right away. She said she was 16 or 17 to avoid going to school. And what did she tell me about work? She worked at the National Biscuit in Lower New York, and she was fired from that job. She told me she was fired. I said, "What'd you do?" She said, "I happened to take a raisin off one of the cookies that I had to package, and it was noticed by one of the supervisors, and I was fired." And then she went to work for United Cigar. She was twirling or making cigars, and she worked hard. She saved the money. She was contributing. Some money, I know she told me, was going to Greece, and some was actually going to her sister, as for, for living, for board. But when the children started coming, my cousin Tom, she helped my aunt raise them, and she lived with my aunt until she got married, which was 1924, 23 or 24. Papu had come out of the army, worked as a butcher, opened up his restaurant, and it wasn't a fixed marriage, she told me. But she was very, very much interested in Papu. They lived in the same tenement, and she apparently had seen him throw out the garbage. No, I'm sorry, go to work early in the morning. So she thought that she would rig it up so it would appear to be by chance meeting him in the morning and chatting with him. So that's what happened. It would happen just about every morning. He would be going to work, and she would be going down to throw the garbage out, and they exchange pleasantries or whatever it was. And finally, I think it was, he asked her, and he went to see her brother and her sister, and that's how it happened. And I can tell you a few more things about their wedding. The best man in the wedding was Thea Pauline's father, Uncle Paul. And he was pretty much of a hothead, but at the wedding, which was somewhere on the Lower East Side, some Hungarian hall or something, someone happened to make a remark about the bride, and it was overheard by Uncle Paul and Uncle Mike, and there was a big fist fight. And I didn't know about it. In fact, I heard about it. I happened to be at Lake George with you and Peter, And one of your father's friends, I forget his name, the funniest man in the world, but he he lived on the Lower East Side. He was considerably older than your father, but he told me about an incident that happened on the Lower East Side. It was some Greek guy marrying some Greek broad or something like that. And I had heard something, but I had heard all of these things from my cousins, from my maternal cousins, but pretty interesting. Then there's another incident, a sad incident, that during the Depression, my Uncle Paul had no job. So my father had bought a stand on Kenmare Street. It was a hot dogs and newspaper, candy, soda, whatever. It was right by the BMT subway on Kenmare Street. And it was a wooden thing that projected from the brick building. And apparently, not apparently, but I remember even on King Street when we had the store, my father would pay off a couple of mafia people. Call it what you may, protection, but it was a cost of being in business. It was an operating cost, and that's what my father was doing. He wanted no trouble, and he did the same thing for the Kenmare store. But Uncle Paul was kind of a hothead, and when it came time that one Sunday or whatever day it was, for whatever money that was set aside to pay off the mafia, he said, "I'm not paying you." And the guy insisted, and he said, "It's your life." And apparently the guy, he stuck to his guns, and he paid for it with his life. He was stabbed to death.
There at that site, at that time, not later.
Right. I heard a different story, but that was coming from, my mother, my father, and my Uncle Mike and his wife. But it was corroborated by my cousin Steve and my cousin Sock. They remember the incident. Steve remembers the incident. In fact, I said, "What happened?" And he wouldn't say mafia. That's the mafia. He just said mafia. And that was a sad story. And Pauline knows about it. She happened to go to the New York Times and look at the news that day. Apparently, there was a little article in the New York Times. But
wow,
so
it's the first I'm hearing about.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so just be go ahead. What were you going to say?
This was.
No, from Pauline was constantly asking you.
She was asking. I kept telling her.
She asked
I didn't
You
want
knew
to tell her.
before she knew.
I knew it from. I had heard that he was stabbed, but I left it at that.
Right.
I kept asking my cousins from my Uncle Mike's sons,
Yeah,
and they said no, he committed suicide. He stuck his head in an oven. That's the story I heard. But then and incidentally, this fellow again. I go back to that weekend that we spent at Lake George. He knew about it.
Mm-hmm.
He told me.
And this was a Greek guy?